The tray almost slipped from Mara Ellison's hands the moment she heard the name Blackwood. The manager of the Silver Pine Lodge had burst through the kitchen doors with his face pale and his voice shaking, and the entire staff froze in place, as if the air itself had turned to ice. The Alpha King was coming to dinner, tonight, in 4 hours, and nothing, absolutely nothing, was ready. Mara did not fully understand why everyone was so afraid. She had worked at the Silver Pine Lodge for almost 2 years, and she knew the restaurant served powerful people, rich people, strange people who spoke in low voices and watched the doors the way soldiers watch a border. But she was just a waitress. She carried plates, refilled glasses, smiled politely, and went home to a tiny apartment where her younger brother Oliver was waiting, too weak from his illness to do much more than read his books and smile at her when she walked in. That smile was the reason she worked double shifts. That smile was the reason her feet ached every night, and her savings jar filled 1 coin at a time. The doctors said Oliver needed a treatment that cost more money than Mara had ever seen in her life. So she worked. She did not complain. She did not ask questions about the strange guests with golden eyes. She just worked. But tonight was different. Tonight, the head chef was sweating through his jacket. Tonight the manager, a nervous man named Peter Hale, kept wiping his hands on a towel and whispering to himself. Tonight, 2 of the waitresses suddenly remembered they were sick and went home, and the head waiter locked himself in the storage room and refused to come out. Peter grabbed Mara by the shoulders. His eyes were wide and desperate. He told her she would be serving the main table, her, the quiet girl from the city, with no family name anyone recognized. She started to protest, but he cut her off. Everyone else was terrified, he said. She was the only one whose hands were not shaking. She was the only one who could stand in that room without falling apart. He begged her. He actually begged. Mara thought of Oliver. She thought of the extra pay Peter promised, 3 times her normal wage for 1 single night. She said yes. What she did not know, what nobody bothered to tell her, was that the man coming to dinner was not a mayor or a businessman or a foreign prince. Damian Blackwood was the Alpha King, the ruler of every wolf pack on the continent, a man whose word could end careers, end alliances, and end lives. He had not appeared in public in almost 3 years, not since his wife had been taken from him in a way no one dared to speak about out loud. He trusted no one. He smiled at no one. The only living creature on earth who could reach the man behind the crown was a 5-year-old girl with dark curls and her mother's eyes. His daughter, Lily. The next 4 hours passed like a storm. The restaurant was scrubbed until the floors shone like mirrors. Fresh flowers arrived in black vans. Then the security came, and this was when Mara first felt something cold move down her spine. These were not normal guards. They were tall, silent men who moved without making a single sound, who checked every window, every vent, every cabinet, and every knife in the kitchen. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with gray at his temples, stopped in front of Mara and looked at her for a long moment. His name, she would later learn, was Edmund Cole, the king's most trusted protector. He asked her name. He asked how long she had worked there. He asked where she was born. Mara answered honestly, because she had nothing to hide. She was an orphan. She had grown up in a state home outside the city. She had a sick brother. She served food. That was her whole life. Edmund studied her face the way a man studies a puzzle with a missing piece. Then he nodded once and moved on, but Mara noticed he kept glancing back at her, and she could not understand why. At exactly 8 in the evening, the doors of the Silver Pine Lodge opened, and the room, which had been full of quiet, wealthy guests, went completely still. Mara was standing near the kitchen with a water pitcher in her hands, and she felt the change in the air before she saw him. It was like the pressure before thunder. Damian Blackwood walked in the way winter walks into a forest. He was tall, dressed in black, and his face could have been carved from stone. He did not look at the bowing guests. He did not look at the trembling manager. His cold gray eyes swept the room once, checking exits, checking faces, checking threats, and then he moved toward the private table at the back with 4 guards around him. And then Mara saw the little girl. Lily Blackwood held her father's hand and looked around the beautiful room with wide, curious eyes. She wore a small blue dress and carried a stuffed rabbit with one ear, nearly loved off. While every adult in the building was busy being afraid of her father, the little girl was busy being delighted by the chandeliers. Mara felt her heart squeeze. She knew that rabbit. Not that exact one, but she knew what it meant. Oliver had carried a stuffed bear just like it through every hospital hallway of his childhood. Children held onto soft things when the world around them was hard. Peter pushed Mara forward with a whispered plea, and she walked to the king's table on legs that suddenly felt like water. The guards watched her hands. The king did not look at her at all. She poured the water without spilling a drop, recited the evening's dishes in a calm voice, and was about to step back when a small voice stopped her.
Lily asked if the kitchen had strawberry cake.
The whole table went quiet. One of the guards actually tensed, as if the question were dangerous. Mara looked down at the little girl clutching her rabbit, and instead of the stiff, formal answer she was supposed to give, she crouched slightly so they were closer to eye level, and told her the truth. The kitchen did not have strawberry cake tonight, but, she added in a secret whisper, the chef had made a chocolate dessert so good that she personally believed it could fix almost any bad day, and if Lily wanted, Mara would make sure she got the piece with the most cherries on top. Lily's entire face lit up like a sunrise. She looked at her father and announced that she liked this lady. For one brief second, Damian Blackwood's eyes finally moved to the waitress standing beside his daughter. Mara felt that gaze like a physical weight, cold and sharp and searching, the gaze of a man who had learned that kindness was usually a mask for something else. She met his eyes without flinching, gave a small polite nod, and walked back toward the kitchen. She did not see the king watch her go. She did not see Edmund Cole lean down and murmur something in his ear. And she certainly did not see, at the far end of the dining room, a new waiter named Victor, quietly adjusting his sleeve. A waiter who had been hired only 2 weeks ago. A waiter whose papers were perfect, whose smile was perfect, whose references were perfect, because every single one of them was fake. In the kitchen, Mara arranged the chocolate dessert on a silver plate and picked out the cherries one by one, choosing the brightest ones and placing them carefully on top, far more than any serving was supposed to have. The pastry chef raised an eyebrow. Mara just shrugged and said it was for someone special. She carried the plate out with both hands, and when she set it in front of Lily, the little girl gasped, as if she had been handed a treasure chest. She counted the cherries out loud. 7. She declared it the best plate she had ever seen in her whole entire life, which she pointed out was 5 years long, so she would know. Mara laughed. It slipped out before she could stop it, a real laugh in a room where no one dared make a sound, and several guests turned to stare. Lily laughed too, and Damian Blackwood, the man who had not smiled in public for 3 years, looked at the waitress laughing with his daughter, and felt something in his chest shift very slightly, like a locked door being tested by a draft. He hated it. He trusted it not at all. In his world, no stranger was ever simply kind. Kindness had a price, a plan, an angle. He made a quiet note to have this woman investigated by morning. Mara refilled the glasses and stepped back to her position near the wall. Her feet hurt. Her shift still had hours left. She thought about Oliver waiting at home, and about the triple pay that would go straight into the savings jar. She allowed herself one small moment of hope that maybe, just maybe, this strange and frightening night would end well. Across the room, the waiter named Victor checked the clock on the wall and slowly began moving between the tables, one step at a time, closer and closer to the child with the stuffed rabbit and the plate of 7 cherries. The evening was warm, the music was soft, and no one in the Silver Pine Lodge had any idea that in 11 minutes, everything was going to change forever. The clock on the wall of the Silver Pine Lodge showed 17 minutes past 9, when Mara noticed the new waiter was carrying an empty tray. It was a small thing, a tiny thing. Any other person would never have seen it at all. But Mara had spent 2 years of her life carrying trays through that dining room, and she knew one simple truth. A waiter never walks toward the most important table in the building with nothing on his tray. You bring water. You bring bread. You bring something, because approaching a guest empty-handed is the fastest way to get fired. Victor was walking toward the king's table with an empty tray, and he was smiling. Mara's stomach tightened before her mind even understood why. She looked at the guards. Edmund Cole was speaking quietly to another protector near the window. 2 guards stood behind the king, watching the main entrance, because that was where danger was supposed to come from. Doors, windows, strangers. Not from a man in a staff uniform who had been pouring wine all evening. Lily was telling her father a long and very serious story about her rabbit, holding the toy up so it could see the chandeliers. Damien was actually listening, his head tilted slightly toward his daughter, and for that one moment, the coldest man in the country was simply a father at dinner. Victor's hand moved to the edge of his tray. Later, people would ask Mara how she knew. Investigators, doctors, guards, even the king himself would ask her the same question in a dozen different ways. How did a waitress see what 4 trained protectors missed? And Mara would never have a good answer. She only knew that time seemed to slow down, that the light caught something thin and silver beneath the tray, and that her body was already moving before her mind finished the thought. She did not scream a warning. There was no time for a warning. Victor reached the table. His arm swept the tray aside, and in his hand was a blade, narrow and bright, and it was moving toward the little girl who was still holding her rabbit up in the air. Mara crashed into the space between them. She did not think about the knife. She did not think about her own body. She thought about 7 cherries on a chocolate dessert and a small voice asking about strawberry cake, and she wrapped herself around Lily Blackwood like a shield, turning her own back to the danger, pulling the child down and against her chest. The blade meant for the little girl's heart sliced deep across Mara's arm instead. The pain arrived a second later, white and burning, worse than anything she had ever felt. As if the metal itself were made of fire, she heard screaming, chairs crashing, glass shattering. She heard a sound come out of Damien Blackwood that did not belong in any human throat, a roar that shook the windows in their frames. She felt Victor being torn away from behind her, felt the rush of bodies, and through all of it, she kept her arms locked around Lily, whispering into the child's curls, over and over, that it was okay, that she was safe, that nothing was going to touch her. The dining room had become a storm. Guards flooded in from every door. Guests were rushed out. Somewhere behind her, Victor was pinned to the floor by 3 men, and Edmund Cole's voice was cutting through the chaos like a whip, giving orders, sealing exits, calling for the doctors. Lily was crying, small hands gripping Mara's shirt, and Mara realized she was on her knees on the floor, without any memory of falling. Her sleeve was soaked and warm. The room was starting to tilt in a slow, sickening way. Then, the king was there. Damien dropped to the floor beside them, and Mara looked up into a face that had transformed. The cold stone mask was gone. What she saw instead was raw terror as his hands ran over his daughter, checking her arms, her face, her chest, searching for any wound and finding none. Not a scratch, not a single mark, because every bit of harm meant for the child had gone into the arm of the woman still holding her. Lily was safe, completely, impossibly safe. Damien's eyes lifted from his daughter to the waitress, and for the first time in 3 years, the Alpha King looked at another person and did not know what he was seeing. Mara tried to say something polite and professional, because some ridiculous part of her brain was still at work, still being a waitress. What came out instead was a quiet apology about the mess on the floor. Then her vision filled with gray fog, and the last things she felt were small hands refusing to let go of her shirt and strong arms catching her before she reached the ground. She woke in pieces. First there was sound, machines beeping softly, low voices arguing somewhere nearby. Then there was light, gentle and golden, coming through tall windows she did not recognize. Then there was pain, a deep, pulsing ache running from her shoulder to her elbow, wrapped tight in white bandages. Mara was lying in a bed larger than her entire bedroom at home, in a room that looked like something from a palace magazine, and standing near the window, arguing in fierce whispers, were 2 men. One was Edmund Cole. The other was a silver-haired man in a doctor's coat, who was holding a folder of papers, as if the folder had personally offended him. The doctor was saying that the results made no sense, that he had run the tests 3 times, that the blade had been treated, coated in something that should have put an ordinary person in far greater danger than this, and yet her body was fighting it off in a way he had only ever seen in one kind of patient. Edmund told him sharply to lower his voice. The doctor did not lower his voice. He said the words that Mara would turn over in her mind 1,000 times in the days to come. He said her blood was behaving like theirs. Then they noticed she was awake, and both men went silent as stone. Before anyone could speak, the door burst open, and a small blue blur shot across the room. Lily scrambled up onto the huge bed, dragging her rabbit, ignoring Edmund's protest completely. and threw her arms around Mara's neck on the uninjured side. She was talking so fast the words tumbled over each other. She had been so scared. She had waited all night by the door. Papa had said the lady was sleeping. The rabbit had been worried too. Mara held the little girl with one arm, and felt her eyes sting, and she could not have explained to anyone why a stranger's child hugging her felt like the first warm thing in a very long, very cold stretch of her life. Then she looked up, and the warmth froze in the doorway's shadow. Damien Blackwood stood there watching them. He had not slept. That much was written in every line of his face. He stepped into the room, told Lily gently that the doctors needed to speak with their guest, and waited while the child made Mara promise, actually promise out loud, that she would not disappear. Mara promised. Lily inspected her face with the deep seriousness of a 5-year-old checking for lies, nodded, and let Edmund carry her out. The door closed. The room went quiet. Damien pulled a chair beside the bed, sat down, and looked at Mara with those cold gray eyes, and when he finally spoke, his voice was calm and quiet and absolutely without warmth. He said that in his experience, no one takes a blade for a stranger. He said everyone who had ever gotten close to his family had wanted something: money, power, position, revenge. He said her employment records had already been pulled, her apartment already visited, her past already opened like a book. And then he leaned forward slightly and asked her, in the same tone another man might use to discuss the weather, what exactly she was hoping to gain. Mara stared at him. The ache in her arm was pounding. She had saved his daughter's life, and this man was interrogating her like a criminal. Something in her chest, something that had been quiet and patient and polite for her entire hard-working life, finally snapped. She told the Alpha King of all the packs, in a low, steady voice, that she did not know who had hurt him badly enough to make him like this, but that where she came from, when a child was in danger, you moved. You did not calculate. You did not negotiate. You moved. She told him she wanted nothing from him except her shoes, her coat, and the door, because her little brother was home alone wondering where she was, and he mattered more to her than every palace and every crown on earth. Then she pushed back the blankets with her good arm and tried to stand. The room spun violently, her legs folded, and Damien Blackwood, who had not moved that fast for anyone in years, was suddenly there, catching her before she fell, his hands careful of her bandaged arm, his face inches from hers, and, for the first time, uncertain. From the doorway came a small, delighted gasp. Lily had escaped Edmund again and was peeking through the gap, and she announced happily to the entire hallway that Papa was hugging the cherry lady. And somewhere far below, in a locked room in the deepest part of the estate, the man called Victor sat chained to a chair, smiled at the guards questioning him, and said only one thing. He said they were already inside. The words traveled through the Blackwood estate faster than fire through dry grass. They were already inside. By morning, every guard had been questioned twice, every staff member's history torn open, every delivery from the past month traced back to its source. Edmund Cole had not slept, and the shadows under his eyes had turned the color of storm clouds, because the truth was worse than a single attacker in a waiter's uniform. Victor's papers had been approved by someone inside the estate. His background had been signed off by someone inside the estate. Someone with access, someone with rank, someone who sat at the king's own table. While the fortress hunted its ghost, Mara was fighting a war of her own inside her bandaged arm. The silver-haired doctor, whose name was Dr. Alfred Grange, came to her room 3 times a day, and each time he left more confused than when he arrived. On the second day, he sat down beside her bed, took off his glasses, cleaned them slowly, and told her plainly that he needed to ask about her parents. Mara told him what she had told Edmund. There was nothing to tell. She had been left at a children's home when she was barely a year old. No records, no relatives, no visits. The only thing her mother had left with her was a small silver locket shaped like a crescent moon, scratched and old, which the staff at the home had kept safe for her until she was 16. She had worn it every day since. It did not open. She had tried 100 times as a child, and the tiny seam had never moved. Dr. Grange asked if he could see it. Mara hesitated, then lifted it from her collar. The old man took the locket in his palm, and Mara watched his face very carefully, because for one unguarded second, The doctor looked like a man who had seen something come back from the dead. Then the look was gone, buried under a polite smile, and he handed the locket back and changed the subject to her bandages. She should have healed slowly. That was what he said, in a strange voice, on the 4th day. A wound like hers, from a blade like that, should have kept her in bed for weeks. Instead, the deep cut was closing at a pace that made the nurses whisper in the hallway. Her fever had burned high for one night, higher than any thermometer in the room wanted to admit, and then vanished completely before sunrise, leaving her strangely clear-headed, strangely strong, and strangely aware of things she had never noticed before. That was the part Mara told no one. The hearing came first. Lying in her room, she began to notice she could hear conversations she had no business hearing. Guards talking 2 floors down, kitchen staff laughing across the courtyard, the tiny heartbeat of a bird on the window ledge. Then came the smells. She knew Lily was coming to visit a full minute before the door opened, because the scent of strawberry soap and crayons arrived ahead of the child like a herald. She knew when Damien walked the hallway outside her room at night, which he did, every single night, pausing outside her door for exactly a few seconds before moving on, and she knew it was him, without ever once looking, because he smelled like cedar and cold air and something wild underneath. She decided she was imagining all of it. The mind did strange things while healing. That was her explanation, and she held on to it the way a drowning person holds on to driftwood. Lily made holding on to anything easier. The little girl had appointed herself Mara's official doctor, arriving each morning with the rabbit, a toy medical kit, and a level of confidence that no actual medical school could ever produce. She listened to Mara's heartbeat with a plastic instrument, declared her patient to be full of hearts, and prescribed cookies. She brought her drawings. She brought her favorite books, and demanded they be read aloud with all the voices, and on the 6th day, she brought something that stopped Mara's breath in her chest. It was a drawing of 3 figures holding hands, a tall, dark-haired man, a small girl, and a woman with brown hair and a bandaged arm, and above them, a crooked sun, and beneath them, in enormous wobbling letters, the word family. Mara stared at that drawing for a long time after Lily left. Then she folded it very carefully, and did not let herself think about why she placed it under her pillow instead of on the table. Damien came in the evenings. The first visit was stiff and short, a king checking on an asset. But Mara had noticed something about the Alpha King that his council, his guards, and his enemies had all missed. The man was not made of ice. The ice was armor, and it was exhausting him. On the 3rd evening, she asked him a question no one had asked him in years, not about security or politics or the investigation, but whether he had eaten dinner. He looked at her as if she had spoken a foreign language. He admitted he had not. She pointed at the ridiculous mountain of food the kitchen kept sending her, and told him to sit, because she was not going to eat all of that alone, and wasting food was the one thing she truly could not stand. And Damien Blackwood, ruler of every pack on the continent, a man who had dined with presidents and stared down warlords, sat in a chair beside a waitress's bed, and ate roasted chicken, while she told him a story about Oliver trying to cook eggs at age 9, and nearly setting their curtains on fire. He did not laugh, but the corner of his mouth moved, actually moved, and Mara counted that as the greatest victory of her week. Oliver himself arrived on the 5th day, because Mara had asked for him with a firmness that made refusal impossible, and the king had sent a car. Her brother stepped out of it thin and wide-eyed, 15 years old, clutching his bag of books, and when he saw Mara's bandaged arm, his face crumpled. She held him while he shook. Then, being Oliver, he recovered by asking approximately 400 questions about the estate, the cars, the guards, and whether the towering man in black by the staircase was who he thought he was. Within 2 days, Oliver and Lily had formed an alliance, built on drawing contests, and shared opinions about desserts, and the sound of 2 children laughing rolled through hallways that had heard no laughter in 3 years. The staff did not know what to do with it. Some of them stood in doorways just to listen. But beneath the warm days, cold currents were moving. Edmund's investigation had narrowed to the inner circle, and the inner circle knew it. At the council table, tempers flared. The Treasury Minister accused the head of security. The head of security accused the Trade Minister. And through it all, one man remained perfectly calm, perfectly helpful, perfectly loyal, the king's oldest advisor, a smooth-voiced man named Gregory Ashford, who had served Damien's father before him, who had held Damien's hand at his wife's funeral, and who now suggested, gently and reasonably, that perhaps the true security risk was the unknown woman recovering in the East Wing. After all, he said, spreading his hands, what did they really know about her? A stranger appears from nowhere, wins the child's heart in a single evening, and is conveniently wounded just badly enough to be brought inside the walls. He was not making an accusation, he assured the council. He was simply asking the question a careful man must ask. The words were poison wrapped in silk, and they worked exactly as intended, because that night, Damien stood outside Mara's door longer than usual, torn between what his scars told him and what his eyes had seen. A woman bleeding on a restaurant floor with his daughter wrapped safely in her arms. Inside the room, Mara was standing at the window, unable to sleep, when it happened. The moon came out from behind the clouds, full and white and enormous, and the light fell across her skin, and every nerve in her body suddenly lit up like a struck match. Her heart began to pound. The old locket at her throat turned warm, then hot, then almost burning against her skin. And from somewhere impossibly deep inside her own chest, in a place she had never known existed, Mara heard something stir for the very first time in 24 years. It was not a sound, it was not a voice, it was a presence, ancient and patient, and hers, uncurling slowly, like a creature waking from a long, long sleep. Mara gripped the windowsill, wide-eyed, breathing hard, staring at the moon, as her locket glowed faintly silver in the dark. And far below, in the shadows of the garden, Gregory Ashford stood watching her lit window, typed a short message on a small black phone, and pressed send. The message contained only 5 words. The Silver Moon child is awake. Mara packed her bag at dawn. The wound had closed enough. The doctors could argue all they wanted. She had a life, a rent payment, a brother with a treatment schedule, and a job that would not hold her position forever. She folded her borrowed clothes into a neat pile on the bed, wore her own faded coat, and was reaching for the door handle when it opened from the other side. Damien stood in the doorway with a folder in his hand. He did not ask where she was going. He simply walked past her to the window, looked out at the grounds for a moment, and then said he had a proposal. His voice was formal, careful, a negotiator's voice. Lily's previous caretaker had resigned after the attack, too frightened to continue. The child was not sleeping. She woke at night calling for 2 people, and one of them was standing in this room with her coat on. He was offering Mara the position, caretaker to his daughter. Live-in residence, her brother welcome, his education and medical needs included. Then he named the salary, and Mara had to grip the back of a chair. The number was more than she earned in 3 years of double shifts. It was Oliver's full treatment. It was a future. It was everything she had been breaking her body to build, offered in a single sentence by a man who spent that much on window repairs. And she almost said no, because Mara Ellison had been poor her whole life, but she had never once been for sale, and something in his careful, watchful tone told her the truth. She looked him in the eye and said it out loud. This was not only a job offer, he wanted her where his guards could see her, because part of him still could not believe she was exactly what she appeared to be. It was not gratitude. It was surveillance with a salary. The silence that followed was long. To his credit, Damien did not deny it. He said, quietly, that he had buried his ability to trust 3 years ago, in the same ground where he buried his wife, and that he was not offering trust, because he had none left to offer. He was offering honesty instead. Yes, he would be watching her, and yes, his daughter genuinely needed her. Both things were true at once, and he would not pretend otherwise. It was the strangest job offer in history, and it was the honesty that decided her. Pretty lies were what people gave the powerless. He had given her the ugly truth as one equal to another. She thought of Oliver's face when the doctors talked about costs. She said yes, on 2 conditions. First, she was a caretaker, not a servant, and she would speak her mind in matters concerning Lily, even if her opinion displeased the Crown. Second, no one was ever to open her mail, enter her rooms without knocking, or follow her brother around like a suspect. Damien agreed to both without blinking, and if there was a flicker of respect in his eyes as they shook hands, both of them pretended not to notice it. Lily's reaction shook chandeliers. When she was told, she screamed with joy, sprinted 3 hallways, and launched herself at Mara, with such force that a guard lunged forward thinking something was wrong. Oliver took the news of their new home by walking silently through the library for 10 minutes, touching book spines the way other boys might touch sports cars, and then asking in a small voice if he was really allowed to read any of them. The head librarian, a stern woman who had frightened staff for 2 decades, adopted him on the spot. The days found a rhythm, and the rhythm slowly changed the house. Mara's mornings began with Lily's lessons, and Mara quickly discovered the palace tutors had been teaching the child like a miniature diplomat, all etiquette and memorized names. Mara threw the schedule out the window. They learned math by baking, doubling recipes, dividing tarts into equal parts. They learned geography by cooking a dish from a different country each week and finding it on the enormous library globe. They learned science in the garden, with mud up to their elbows, which caused the head housekeeper genuine physical distress. Lily bloomed like a plant, moved into sunlight. She slept through the night for the first time within a week, and everyone in the household knew exactly whose door she would run to if she did wake. The nightmares came less often. When they did come, Mara sat with her in the dark, and one night, holding the child close, she caught herself humming a melody she did not remember learning, something old and soft that rose from somewhere below memory. Lily fell asleep in minutes. Down the hallway, standing frozen outside the door, Damian Blackwood went pale, because he had heard that exact melody once before, many years ago, sung in a language from the old northern Pax, and it was not a song that any human orphan from a state home should know. He said nothing. He added it to the growing pile of things about Mara Ellison that did not add up, a pile he found himself guarding rather than reporting. Because the king was changing too, and the whole estate could see it. He began appearing at Lily's dinner table, which he had not done since his wife died, first once a week, then most nights. He was drawn there by his daughter's laughter, and kept there by something he refused to name, the sight of Mara arguing with him about children's books, the way she never once flinched from his opinions, the way she thanked the serving staff by name. He started finding excuses. Papers that needed signing in the library where she happened to be reading. Security questions that could only be discussed on evening walks through the garden. Edmund Cole watched his king invent the least believable excuses in political history, and wisely kept his face blank. On those garden walks, they talked. Really talked. She told him about growing up with nothing and no one except a baby brother she had promised to protect. He told her, in pieces, in fragments, about a father whose cruelty had made the whole continent tremble, about growing up learning that love was a weakness enemies would aim at, and about the night that lesson had come true in the worst way possible. He had never spoken of it to anyone. He could not explain why the words came out with her. Mara did not offer pity, which he would have hated. She simply listened, and then said the only thing that had ever actually helped, that carrying a wound was not weakness, and that his daughter did not need a perfect king, only a present father. That night, Damian sat alone in his study for a long time, staring at nothing, coming to terms with a terrifying discovery. The stranger he had hired to watch was becoming the only person on earth he wanted to talk to. But peace in the Blackwood estate was always borrowed, never owned. Edmund came to the study past midnight, with a face like carved granite, and laid 3 photographs on the desk. The estate's food supplier had flagged an inspection van that did not belong to any registered company. The photographs showed the van parked on the forest road beyond the east fence, on 3 separate nights, always positioned with a clear line of sight to the same lit window in the east wing. Not the king's window, not Lily's, Mara's. Damian stared at the photographs, and the cold that filled his chest was a new kind of cold. Because for 3 years, every threat had aimed at his crown, or his child, and he had built his fortress accordingly. No one had ever aimed at her. His voice, when he finally spoke, was very quiet, and the quiet was more frightening than any shout. He told Edmund to double the East Wing patrols without telling Mara, to trace the van to its owner no matter what it cost, and to bring him everything, that existed on record about a pack called Silvermoon. Edmund's head came up sharply. He asked where the king had heard that name. Damian slid the last photograph across the desk. In it, enlarged and slightly blurred, the van's side door stood partially open, and painted on the inside panel, old and faded but unmistakable, was a crescent moon, with a line through it, the ancient mark used by only one group in the world, the hunters who had spent 20 years making sure the Silvermoon pack stayed extinct. Except, As both men were beginning to understand, it was not extinct. It was teaching a little girl fractions with apple tarts, 200 meters from where they stood. Dr. Grange requested the meeting himself, which had never happened before, and he requested that both the king and Mara be present, which had never happened at all. They gathered in the medical wing office, Damien standing by the window, Mara seated, the old doctor holding a folder that trembled very slightly in his hands. He had rerun her blood work 7 times, he said. 7. He had sent samples under false names to 2 different laboratories to be certain his own equipment was not failing. And the answer came back the same every time. An answer that rewrote everything they thought they knew about the woman in front of them. Mara Ellison was not human. She never had been. She carried wolf blood, old blood, the doctor said, purer and stronger than any sample he had tested in 40 years of practice. But it had been suppressed, locked away, and not by nature, by design. Someone had sealed her wolf before her 2nd birthday, using a binding method, so rare and so difficult that fewer than a handful of healers in the world had ever known how to perform it. It was not a curse. It was a hiding place. Someone had loved this child enough, and feared for this child enough, to bury the most powerful part of her, where no enemy could ever sense it, and then leave her among humans, where no one would ever think to look. The room was completely silent. Mara heard her own heartbeat. She heard, though she should not have been able to, Damien's heartbeat too, and it was not calm. She asked the only question that mattered. Why was it waking up now? Dr. Grange looked at her bandaged arm. The blade, he said. The treated blade had cut deeper than flesh. It had damaged the binding itself, cracked it like a hammer striking a very old lock. The full moon had poured through the crack. Her senses, her healing, the warmth of the locket, the presence stirring in her chest, all of it was one thing. Her wolf was waking after 24 years, and there was no way on earth to put it back to sleep. Mara walked out of that office, and did not stop walking until she reached the far edge of the gardens, where the lawns gave way to wild forest, and there her legs simply quit. She sat down on the grass, and stared at her own hands, as if they belonged to a stranger. Everything she knew about herself had just been pulled out from under her like a rug. The orphan, the waitress, the ordinary girl. All of it was a costume someone had dressed her in as a baby, and she had worn it her whole life without knowing. She did not hear Damien approach, which meant he had allowed her not to hear him. He sat down on the grass beside her, the Alpha King in his black coat, sitting in the dirt, and for a long time he said nothing at all. Then he told her something he had never told his council. When his mother died, he had been 8 years old, and his father had informed him at breakfast, between other items of business, and forbidden mourning, as a display of weakness. He had learned that day that the ground can vanish under a person, and the world will still demand they keep walking. So he would not insult her by saying he understood her situation, but he understood the vanishing ground, and he wanted her to know one thing, that whatever her blood turned out to be, the person who threw herself over his daughter was not a costume. That was the realest thing he had ever seen. Mara looked at him, this cold and ruined and stubbornly decent man, and felt something in her own chest answer him, and it frightened her more than the wolf did. The attack came 9 days later, and it came clever. It did not come at the estate walls, which were a fortress. It came on the one afternoon the walls were left behind. A long-promised visit to the autumn fair in the valley town, a tradition of Lily's mother that Damien had finally, at Mara's gentle insistence, agreed to revive. Security was heavy, but invisible. Guards dressed as farmers and vendors, Edmund himself running the perimeter. Lily rode the painted carousel twice. Oliver won a ridiculous oversized duck at the ring toss and presented it to Lily with a formal bow. Damien Blackwood ate fried dough with his bare hands standing next to a pumpkin cart, and Mara laughed at the powdered sugar on his black coat until her ribs hurt. Then the crowd shifted, and Mara smelled it. It cut through the caramel and wood smoke and cinnamon like a blade through cloth, a scent of wet rust and cold ash that touched something ancient in her spine. Her body reacted before her mind, the way it had at the restaurant, but this time it was different, sharper, informed. She knew, without knowing how she knew, that there were 4 of them, that they had split into pairs, and that they were not moving toward the king at the pumpkin cart. They were flowing quietly through the crowd toward the carousel, where Lily and Oliver stood in line for a third ride, 40 meters from the nearest disguised guard. There was no time to explain. Mara moved. Witnesses said afterward that they saw a young woman cross the fairground faster than seemed possible, weaving through the crowd like water through stones. She reached the children 3 steps ahead of the first man, spun both of them behind her, and stood her ground in front of 2 strangers, whose faces she had never seen, but whose smell her blood had known for 1,000 years. What happened next lasted 11 seconds. She would remember it in fragments, a hand reaching for Oliver, her own grip catching the man's wrist and turning, some deep instinct guiding the movement with a strength and precision she had never trained, the man's legs sweeping out from under him, the second attacker lunging and meeting her elbow, her low, rolling snarl, an actual snarl, rising out of her human throat with such raw animal authority that both men, trained rogues, hesitated. And that hesitation cost them everything, because that was when Damien arrived like a landslide, with Edmund and 6 guards a heartbeat behind him, and the fight, if it could even be called that, was over. The other pair of attackers fled and were run down at the tree line. The fair dissolved into flashing lights and controlled panic, and in the middle of it, Mara stood with an arm around each child, Lily's face buried in her side, Oliver clinging to her shaking, and she realized her heartbeat was steady, perfectly steady. The presence in her chest was not frightened, it was satisfied. That night, back behind the fortress walls, after the children had finally fallen asleep in the same room, because neither would let the other out of sight, Damien found Mara on the east terrace, staring at the moon. He stood beside her at the railing. He had watched the security footage, he said quietly, frame by frame. What she had done was not luck and not adrenaline. Her body had moved with the trained instincts of a warrior line, instincts that lived in the blood of only the oldest pack families. Whoever her people had been, they were not simply wolves. They were guardians of something. Mara touched the crescent locket at her throat, warm again in the moonlight, and asked the question into the dark, barely a whisper. Who am I? Damien looked at her profile in the silver light, and 2 truths sat on his tongue. The first was that his investigators had, that very morning, matched the mark on the hunter's van to the records his father had sealed, and that the trail of her locket led into those same records, into pages describing a massacre that his own bloodline had ordered. The second truth was that he was falling for her, hopelessly, completely, and against every rule he had built to survive. He was a king, a strategist, a man of careful timing. He decided the first truth needed more proof before it could be spoken. He told himself this was wisdom. It was the worst decision of his life. The sealed records arrived in a steel case with 2 locks, carried by a courier who had driven through the night from the old Capitol archives. Damien opened it alone in his study at 3 a.m, and what he read aged him. 22 years ago, in the high northern valleys, there had lived a pack called Silver Moon. They were old blood, healer blood, guardian blood, keepers of knowledge from before the packs had kings at all. And when Damien's father, the old tyrant, had demanded that every pack on the continent kneel and surrender their independence, the Silver Moon Alpha, a man named Rowan, had stood up in the Great Assembly and refused. He had not raised an army. He had simply said no, and said it with such quiet moral force that other packs began to waver. The old king's answer was written in the file, in cold administrative language that made it worse. A campaign, a siege of the northern valleys, and at the end of it, on a winter night, the Silver Moon pack ceased to exist. The file listed the dead, Alpha Rowan, his wife, the healer Elena, their household, their warriors, their children. Except one line in the report had been amended, years later, in different ink. The body of the Alpha's infant daughter was never recovered. Damien sat back, and the pieces fell into place, with a sound like a tomb closing. Elena of Silver Moon had been the most gifted healer of her generation, one of perhaps 3 people alive who could have performed a binding deep enough to hide a wolf child among humans forever. She had not tried to save herself. In the final hours of the siege, she had used everything she had to seal her baby daughter's blood, hang a crescent locket around her neck, and send her south with someone loyal enough to die silent, which they evidently had, because the trail ended at the door of a state children's home, with an unnamed girl of about 1 year old. Mara, the last daughter of Silver Moon, the child his father had hunted, the woman who had bled to protect his own daughter, sleeping right now under his roof, was the sole survivor of his family's greatest crime. Damien did not sleep that night, or properly for many nights after. He told only Edmund, swearing him to silence, and began, quietly, to act. He ordered the legal groundwork, drawn up in secret, to restore the Silver Moon lands, which had sat under Crown seal for 2 decades, to their rightful heir. He tripled the hunt for the Hunters Network, because the old crescent and line mark meant fanatics who finished what they started. And he told himself, every single day, that he was waiting for the right moment to tell her, when the proof was complete, when the danger was contained, when the words would not destroy the fragile, precious thing growing between them. Because it was growing. Everyone saw it. Autumn deepened into early winter, and the Blackwood estate, that mausoleum of a fortress, came alive. Lily's laughter had been the first crack in the ice. Now there was Oliver debating history with the librarian, Mara teaching the terrified kitchen staff that the king would not actually explode if dinner was 5 minutes late, and the king himself, unbelievably, being seen to smile. Guards swapped stories about it in the barracks, like sightings of a rare comet. For Mara, those weeks glowed with a happiness she kept examining suspiciously, like a coin that had to be counterfeit. Oliver's treatment had begun, funded without ceremony, and color was returning to her brother's face for the first time in years. Her wolf was settling into her bones day by day, no longer a stranger but a companion, sharpening her senses, steadying her heart. Dr. Grange tutored her quietly in what she was, and old instincts unfolded in her like letters from her parents she was only now allowed to read. And there was Damien. Somewhere between the garden walks and the arguments over Lily's bedtime, and the evenings when the 4 of them ate dinner like the family in Lily's drawing, the space between the king and the caretaker had grown warm and charged and impossible to ignore. He noticed everything about her, and pretended he did not. She heard his heart quicken when she entered a room, which was a spectacularly unfair advantage, and told no one. On the night of the first snow, they stood on the east terrace, watching the flakes come down, and his hand covered hers on the cold railing, and neither of them moved for a very long time, and nothing was said, because both of them were people whom life had taught that the moment you name a happiness, someone takes it from you. They were both right. The unraveling began with a small thing, the way avalanches do. Oliver, who had become the estate's unofficial mascot and wandered everywhere, mentioned at dinner that he had seen Lord Ashford coming out of the old archive room in the north cellar, which struck Oliver as funny, because the archive room was where the boring flood records were kept, and Lord Ashford had told him he was fetching flood records, but he had been carrying nothing at all. Mara saw Damien and Edmund exchange a glance that lasted a quarter of a second. That night the 2 men searched the archive room and found, behind the flood ledgers, a loose stone, and behind the loose stone a cavity, and in the cavity, nothing, only the clean, dustless outline of a small box recently removed. Gregory Ashford had been warned by something, and had cleared his hiding place, but he had made one mistake, a single corner of paper fallen behind the stone, and on it, in Ashford's own elegant handwriting, were payment figures, dates going back 3 years, and a name that stopped Damien's blood. The last date was 3 years old. It was the week his wife had died, in what the world had been told was an accident. Everything Damien had believed about his own life detonated silently in that cellar. The traitor was not new. The traitor had been beside him for decades, holding his hand at the funeral he had caused, and the attack on Lily had not been the beginning of something. It was the continuation. Edmund wanted to arrest Ashford within the hour. Damien, with a self-control that cost him more than any battle, said no. A single corner of paper was not proof that would hold before the full council, and Ashford owned friends on that council. Worse, arrest him now, and his network of hunters would scatter into the mist and come back in 10 years for Lily, or for Mara. No, they would watch him, feed him false information, and map every thread of his web, and when they finally pulled, everything would come down at once. For 11 days, it worked. Ashford, subtly monitored, led them to 2 paymasters and a communications drop. But Gregory Ashford had survived 2 kings by smelling the wind before it changed. On the 12th day, he requested a formal audience before the full council, the one place where old law said any noble advisor could speak without interruption, and Damien could not refuse without revealing his hand. The chamber filled. Ministers, generals, pack representatives. Mara was summoned too, which was unusual, but she had official standing now, as the ward caretaker of the heir, and she stood near the great doors in her simple gray dress, among all that velvet. Ashford rose, smooth and silver-tongued, and began not with a defense, but with an attack. He spoke of security, of vigilance, of wolves in the fold, and then, turning with theatrical sorrow, he asked the council why their king had spent weeks secretly preparing to transfer the sealed Silvermoon territories, crown lands, to a servant in his own household, why the royal doctor's files on this servant were locked under the king's personal seal, and whether the council was aware, as he regretfully was, of exactly who the woman standing by the doors truly was. The chamber turned. Mara felt every eye land on her. And Gregory Ashford, looking straight at her with gentle, poisonous pity, announced to the assembled leadership of the continent that their heir's beloved caretaker was the last blood of Silvermoon, the daughter of Alpha Rowan, hidden survivor of the Northern Purge, and that the king had known this for weeks, hidden it from his council, hidden it from the realm, and, judging by her face, poor girl, hidden it from her as well. The last part was the blade, and he had aimed it perfectly. Because Mara was not looking at Ashford, she was looking at Damien, and Damien was not looking back at her with shock or confusion. He was looking at her with guilt. The chamber erupted into shouting. Mara heard none of it. The marble floor, the velvet crowd, the ancient banners, all of it went distant and silent, and in that silence, only one fact remained standing. He had known. Her name, her family, her murdered parents. The entire stolen story of her life had been sitting in his locked drawer, and he had walked with her in the garden, held her hand in the snow, watched her whisper, "Who am I?" to the moon, and said nothing. She turned and walked out of the council chamber, and the great doors closing behind her sounded, to Damien, exactly like the world ending. Damien caught up with her in the long portrait hallway, past the painted faces of 100 Blackwood ancestors, and when he said her name she stopped but did not turn around. He told her he could explain. She said nothing. He told her he had been waiting for proof, for safety, for the right moment. And at that, finally, Mara turned, and the look on her face was worse than fury. It was disappointment, quiet and bottomless. She did not raise her voice. That was the part he would remember. She simply asked him, in a level tone, how long? He told her the truth, because lying now would have been obscene. 19 days. She nodded slowly, doing the arithmetic of betrayal. 19 days of dinners. 19 days of garden walks, the snow on the terrace, his hand over hers. 19 days of watching her mourn a family she could not remember, while the file containing their names sat behind his study door. Then she said the thing that broke him. She said she understood why the council was kept in the dark, and the realm, and even the staff, because that was politics and she had never once cared about politics. But her mother's name was not politics. Her father's face was not politics. It was hers. It was the only inheritance she had, and he had held it back from her the way kings hold everything, as an asset, waiting for the right moment to spend it. She had believed she was the one person he did not manage. She had been wrong, and she could forgive almost anything on earth except being managed by the man she had started to love. The word landed between them, in the past tense, and did more damage than the hunter's blades ever had. Damien, for once in his armored life, abandoned strategy entirely. He told her the whole truth in a rush, standing there under his ancestors' painted eyes. What his father had done to her family, the amended report, the locket, her mother, the binding, the courier, the land transfer he had been building in secret, not as a gift, and not as an apology, because no apology was possible, but as a return of stolen property to its owner. He told her he had been a coward, that every day he had meant to speak, and every day he had looked at what they had, the dinners, the children, her laughter in his dead house, and could not make himself be the one to set it on fire. He said her name once more, quietly, and it was as close to begging as the Alpha King had come in his entire life. Mara listened to all of it. Then she said she believed him, every word, and that it changed nothing, because trust was not about facts. It was about who gets to decide what you are allowed to know about your own life, and he had decided, alone, for 19 days, exactly like a king. She was taking Oliver, and she was going home. He could have stopped her. One word, and the gates would have sealed. They both knew it, and she watched him understand that keeping her by force would prove her right in the deepest possible way. So Damien Blackwood did the hardest thing he had ever done. He stepped aside. Leaving was ugly. Practical things always are. There were her wages, which she took because she had earned every coin, and Oliver's treatment was not finished. There was Dr. Grange, who pressed his private phone number into her hand and told her, urgently, that her wolf was still settling, that the next full moons would be difficult, and that she must call him, promise him, at the first sign of fever. And there was Lily. There was no version of that goodbye that did not tear something. Mara had promised the child, months ago in a medical bed, that she would not disappear, and now she knelt in the great entrance hall trying to explain, in 5-year-old language, that she was not disappearing, that this was not Lily's fault, that nothing on earth was Lily's fault, while the little girl sobbed and clutched her sleeve and finally, in desperation, shoved the worn stuffed rabbit into Mara's hands and said, hiccuping, that the rabbit would take care of her, and Mara had to leave then, right then, or she never would have left at all. She did not look back at the man standing gray-faced at the top of the stairs. Oliver did, briefly. He was 15, and he understood more than anyone credited him with. And the look he gave the king was not angry. It was sorry. That was somehow worse. The city apartment was exactly as they had left it, small and cold and honest. Mara got her old job back within a week, because Peter Hale would have rehired her on the moon itself after what had happened in his dining room, and the Silver Pine Lodge staff treated her with a wary awe she pretended not to notice. Life shrank back to its old size. Trays and tips and rent. Oliver's treatments continued at the city hospital, prepaid in full, the last unrefusable kindness of a man she was trying not to think about. She failed at not thinking about him, roughly nightly. Meanwhile, the estate she had left behind was quietly dying again. Lily stopped eating properly. She stopped drawing. She asked for the cherry lady every night, and then she stopped asking, which was infinitely worse. Damien ruled flawlessly, and moved through his own halls like a ghost with a schedule. The staff who had heard him laugh that autumn now heard nothing at all. Only Edmund saw the king stand at the East Terrace railing at night, staring at a city glowing on the horizon, and Edmund, wisely, said nothing. But Damien had not stopped working. Grief he could not fix. Ashford he could. The advisor had played his counsel card, believing the scandal would bury the investigation into himself. And for a while, the council chaos protected him exactly as planned. What Ashford had not counted on was a king, with nothing warm left to lose. Damien and Edmund pulled the web thread by thread, coldly and patiently, arrest by quiet arrest, and one paymaster talked, and then a forger, and the trail of money and messages wound upward through the years. Through Victor, and the fair, and the watching van, through the death of a queen, all of it hanging from one silver-tongued spider. 60 miles away, the spider had already left the web. Gregory Ashford had vanished from his townhouse the night the first paymaster was taken, leaving his fires burning to buy hours, and made for the deep forest camps of the rogue packs and hunter cells he had funded for a decade. And there, in a lamp-lit tent, he gave the assembled leaders a new plan, because Ashford had realized what the king himself barely understood. The throne no longer had one heart to strike at. It had two, and the second one had just walked out of the fortress, away from the walls and the guards and the doubled patrols, and was currently carrying dinner plates in a city restaurant, protected by absolutely nothing. He told them about Silvermoon. He watched the old hunters' faces change at the name, watched 20-year-old fanaticism catch fire like dry timber. The last daughter was alive, he told them. Her wolf was waking. Every month she grew stronger, and worse. Her name alone could rally the old northern families who had never loved the Blackwood crown. She was a symbol, a rallying banner, and an unfinished job. Deep in the forest, in the dark, the crescent and line was painted on fresh banners, for the first time in 20 years. And in the city, on a rainy Tuesday night, Mara Ellison locked up the Silver Pine Lodge after a double shift, stepped out into the wet street, and stopped, keys in hand, as her wolf rose sharply inside her chest, for the first time in weeks. Somewhere in the darkness across the road, cutting through the rain and the exhaust and the smell of the city, faint but unmistakable, was wet rust and cold ash. They had found her. Mara did not run. Running, some old instinct told her, was how prey behaved, and the scent across the street belonged to something that chased. So she walked, steady and unhurried, taking the long route home, through bright streets and busy corners, and behind her, the scent followed at a fixed distance, patient as winter. By the time she reached her building, she had learned 3 things. There was only one of them tonight. He was not attacking. He was confirming. They were not there yet to strike. They were there to be sure. That night she sat at the kitchen table, long after Oliver went to bed, the stuffed rabbit watching her from the shelf, and made the coldest calculation of her life. She could call the estate. One phone call and there would be guards on her street by dawn. And she would be back inside those walls, back under that watchful care, back to being managed, and everything she had walked away from on principle would be undone by fear. Or she could handle it herself, except she did not yet know what herself even was. She chose a third path. She called Dr. Grange. The old doctor did not lecture and did not, as far as she could tell, inform the king. He came to the city personally within 2 days, took rooms near the hospital under a plain name, and began teaching her in earnest, in a rented garage space at dawn before her shifts. Everything a Silver Moon child should have learned across 20 years, compressed into weeks. How to breathe with the wolf instead of against it. How to sort a street full of scents like mail. How to let the strength rise on purpose, instead of only in terror. The full moon that month was the hardest night of her life. Fever and shaking, and her bones singing like struck bells, and she wrote it out on the garage floor, with the doctor reading temperatures and old northern texts in equal measure. And when the sun rose, Mara stood up changed, not transformed, settled. The presence in her chest and the woman around it had stopped being two things. Grange watched her move through her forms that morning, and said quietly that he had treated wolves for 40 years, and that her mother's people had been called guardians for a reason, and that he pitied, professionally and sincerely, whoever the crescent banner sent. They sent watchers first, in shifts, week after week. Mara learned their scents individually, and gave them private nicknames. She noted their rotations from the restaurant windows, while refilling water glasses. She was terrified in a low, constant way, and she was also, strangely, becoming excellent at this. What she could not see was the shape of the larger plan, because Ashford's true target had never been a quick strike in an alley. The old spider was building a stage. A dead waitress moved no armies. But the last daughter of Silvermoon, captured, displayed, and executed under the crescent banner as the hunter's final triumph, that would light a fire under every old feud on the continent, shatter the northern family's fragile peace with the crown, and leave a grieving, unstable king, ripe for removal. Ashford did not want Mara gone. He wanted her famous first. The estate, meanwhile, was closing its own net. The captured paymasters had given up the forest camps region, and Edmund's scouts were mapping them one by one. The plan was surgical. Simultaneous raids. No warning. The entire network in a single night. And the date was set for the dark of the moon. In the war room, Damien stood over the maps for hours, and Edmund watched him place and replace one marker at the map's edge, far from any camp, a small marker sitting on the city, on one specific street, and finally Edmund broke his own silence, and asked when the king had last simply spoken to her. Damien said she had made her wishes clear. Edmund, who had served the family 30 years and buried one queen, replied that wishes made in a hallway in the worst hour of a person's life were not laws of physics, and went back to his maps, having said his piece. Damien wrote her 11 letters that month and burned every one. Then came the night of the council summit in the old capital, the great yearly gathering of pack leaders. 3 days of ceremony the crown could not skip, especially with the realm whispering about scandal and Silvermoon. Damien went, because duty was the last language he had left. And it was there, on the second evening, between sessions, that Edmund appeared at his shoulder, with a face Damien had seen only twice in 30 years, and a phone in his hand. The scouts watching the forest camps had reported movement. All camps, all at once, emptying, not scattering, converging. Every rogue and hunter Ashford owned, upward of 40, moving in coordinated columns through the winter forest, toward a single destination. And the destination was not the estate, which stood fortified and expectant. The columns were curving south, toward the city. Toward her. The summit hall behind them was filling for the evening session, the assembled leadership of the continent, protocol older than the crown itself, and the raid teams were positioned for camps that were now empty, hours from being redeployed. Damien stood in that marble corridor for exactly 4 seconds, and in those 4 seconds, the king and the man fought their final round, and the man won by a landslide. He handed the summit to his stunned deputy with one sentence, took Edmund and every guard he could strip from his own detail, and was in the air within the half hour, and let the council make of it whatever they wished. Behind him, Pack leaders poured onto the steps to watch the royal transport rise into the dark, and the whisper that ran through them would reshape his reign more than any speech, because the coldest king in living memory had just walked out of the throne of the continent for a waitress, and everyone knew it. In the city, the evening had begun gently. It was Oliver's birthday, 16. Mara had traded shifts to get the night free, and the little apartment was full of the smell of roast chicken and the particular happiness of small celebrations. Dr. Grange had come with a wrapped book. Oliver was laughing at something, wearing a paper crown Mara had made him as a joke, and Mara was carrying the cake out of the kitchen, 16 candles lit, when every hair on her body rose at once. The scents hit her together. Not one watcher, not two. A wall of wet rust and cold ash rolling in from every direction at once. From the street, the alley, the rooftop opposite, the stairwell below. The candle flames trembled with the building's front door, 3 floors down, opening quietly. Mara set the cake down very slowly on the table, looked at her brother in his paper crown, and told him, in a calm voice that fooled nobody, to go with the doctor to the back room and hold the rabbit, and not to come out until she said. Then she turned the lights off, faced the apartment door in the dark, and let the wolf all the way up for the very first time. They came up the stairwell quietly, and they found the 3rd-floor hallway dark, and the apartment door standing wide open, which was the first thing that went wrong for them, because it meant she had chosen the ground. Mara met them in the narrow hall where numbers meant nothing, where only 2 could come at her at once, no matter how many filled the stairs. The weeks with Dr. Grange poured through her body like a language she had finally become fluent in. She was fast in a way the first 2 men simply could not process, moving under reaching arms, using their own weight and the walls, and both went down before either understood the fight had started. The next pair came harder and more careful, and she gave ground on purpose, drawing them past door frames, and the hallway filled with the sounds of effort and impact and, threading through all of it, a low, rolling snarl that made men who had hunted wolves for 20 years grip their weapons tighter and glance behind them. But there were so many. That was Ashford's entire strategy, that no lone guardian, however gifted, outlasts 40. They pressed her back, meter by meter, toward the apartment door, and fresh attackers stepped over groaning ones, and Mara's arms grew heavy, and a blade opened a burning line across her shoulder, and another caught her hip, and she understood with cold clarity that she was not going to lose this fight in the next minute, but she was absolutely going to lose it in 10. She was wrong about that, because she had done her arithmetic without the sky. The first sign was the window at the end of the hallway lighting up white. Then the sound arrived, engines, multiple, low and enormous, and the entire building shook as transports flared to a landing in the street and on the roof itself, and the crescent hunters in the stairwell heard something that had not been heard in the north in 20 years, the full battle horn of the Blackwood Royal Guard, close enough to rattle the teeth. The hallway seemed to freeze in place. What followed was less a battle than a tide. Royal Guards came up the stairwell like floodwater, and down from the roof access, at the same moment, Edmund Cole directing them with terrifying calm, and the cornered hunters, fanatics but not fools, broke in every direction. And through the middle of all of it, ignoring tactics, ignoring protocol, ignoring the shouted objections of his own protectors, came Damian Blackwood, wrenching attackers out of his path with his bare hands, following the one scent in the world that mattered to him. And he turned the corner of that shabby 3rd-floor hallway and saw her, bleeding, swaying, upright, alive, holding the door of a 2-bedroom apartment like the last gate of a fortress. Their eyes met down the wrecked hallway, and every unsent letter passed between them in a single second. Then her eyes went wide, fixed on something behind him, and the second passed. Ashford had come personally after all, too vain to miss his own masterpiece, and with his masterpiece collapsing, he did what spiders do when the web tears. He struck at what was closest, and what was closest, wading through the chaos with his back half turned, was the king. The old advisor came out of a doorway with a hunter's silver blade, moving with a speed no one had ever suspected in him, and there was no guard near enough, and there was no time, and there was only Mara. She crossed the hallway faster than she had ever moved in her life, and she was still going to be half a step late, and Damian, warned by her face, turned into the strike instead of away from it, taking the blade meant for his back high in the chest instead, and his hand closed on Ashford's wrist, like a trap closing, and then Mara arrived. The last daughter of Silvermoon hit the man who had orchestrated the destruction of 2 families, like the judgment of 20 years, arriving all at once. It was not a long fight. It was barely a fight at all. Ashford was down and pinned and screaming legal precedents into the floorboards when Edmund's men took him, and Mara had already turned away, because Damien was on his knees, with silver in his chest and his blood coming through his coat, and the whole world had narrowed to that. She got him onto his back with his head in her lap. Around them the building filled with guards, and the fighting guttered out, and someone was bellowing for the medics, and Damien Blackwood looked up at her face above him and smiled. Actually smiled, the second one she had ever seen, and told her the thing he had flown out of a summit to say, in case the medics lost the race. He told her all of it, the words tumbling in the wrong order, the way true things do, that he was sorry, not king sorry, not political sorry, but sorry in the oldest and plainest way. That the land transfer had been signed and sealed before the council ever heard her name, dated weeks earlier, because Silvermoon was hers, whether she ever forgave him or not, and forgiveness had never been its price. That his father had taken her family from her, and he had taken her trust, and she owed the Blackwood name less than nothing, and that the happiest he had ever been in his entire armored life was a rainy Thursday in the library, when she had fallen asleep mid-argument about a children's book, and he had sat there for 2 hours without moving, so the light would not wake her, and he had thought, this, whatever this is what I was building all those walls to protect, and never had. Mara was crying onto the face of the Alpha King, and she informed him, fiercely, that he was not allowed to say goodbye things, that goodbye things were forbidden, that Lily needed him, and the realm needed him, and, fine, yes, she needed him, and he had better fight, because she had taken a blade for this family once, and she was not raising his daughter alone. His eyes were fading, but the smile held, and he whispered that this was the first order anyone had given him in 30 years, and that he intended to obey it. Then the medics were there, and Dr. Grange with them, tearing the coat open, calling out words like silver toxicity and airlift, and Mara stood back with her arms around a shaking 16-year-old in a crooked paper crown, in the ruins of a birthday party, in a hallway full of history, and watched them carry the king she loved into the winter sky. The silver had missed his heart by 2 centimeters. The toxin nearly finished what the blade had not. For 4 days the continent held its breath around a hospital wing in the old capital, while the strongest doctors of every pack fought for one man, and the northern families, hearing at last the full story of Ashford, the Purge, and the Waitress from the Silvermoon line who had shielded the Blackwood King with her own body, began arriving in the capital, not with old grievances, but with their healers. On the 5th morning, Damien opened his eyes. The first thing he saw was a stuffed rabbit with one loved-off ear sitting on his chest, standing guard. The second was his daughter, asleep against his side. And the third was Mara Ellison in the chair beside the bed, where she had spent 5 days, awake instantly the moment his breathing changed, and the look on her face told him everything the doctors were about to, that he had, as ordered, survived. He reached out his hand across the blanket. She took it. Neither of them let go. The trial of Gregory Ashford lasted 3 weeks and cleaned 20 years of poison out of the realm's veins. Faced with the recovered records, the testimony of his own paymasters, and a king who sat through every session with silver scarring under his shirt and winter in his eyes, the old advisor's silk finally ran out. The full truth of the Northern Purge entered the public record at last. The old tyrant's orders, the massacre of Silvermoon, the long hunt for a missing infant, and the death of a queen who had quietly begun investigating her father-in-law's crimes and gotten too close. Ashford and his network would spend the rest of their lives behind stone, and when the verdict was read, it was noted by everyone present that the king did not look at the prisoner at all. He looked at the woman seated in the gallery, as if the verdict belonged to her, which, in every way that mattered, it did. 1 month later, in the great council chamber where her name had once been used as a weapon, Mara stood before the assembled leadership of the continent as Damien formally broke the crown seal on the northern valleys and restored the lands, the name, and the standing of the Silvermoon Pack to its last living daughter. He did it by the old words and the old law, and he expected nothing, and he made sure the entire chamber knew he expected nothing. The debt of the Blackwood name was being paid, he said, not negotiated. She was free, wealthy, titled, and owed this court not even a goodbye. The chamber waited for the orphan waitress to take her inheritance and walk out of the story. Mara stood up, and the room that had once made her feel small in a gray dress discovered that it had gotten the situation entirely backward. She thanked the council. She accepted the restoration of her family's name and lands, and announced that Silvermoon would open its valleys again, as a place of healing and learning in her mother's tradition, and a home for any wolf or human the world had orphaned, because she had been both, and knew exactly what such a place was worth. Then she said that she had heard, many times now, the story of how the waitress had saved the king's daughter, and that the story was told wrong. Lily Blackwood had saved her first, she said, on an ordinary evening, with one question about strawberry cake, by looking at an invisible woman, and actually seeing her. Every single thing that followed had grown from that. So no, she would not be leaving. Her lands were in the north, but her family, she had discovered, was not a place. She looked directly at the king in front of the entire continent when she said the word family, and the oldest pack leaders present, hard-faced northern elders who had knelt to two Blackwood kings without smiling once, watched their coldest sovereign turn visibly red, and the chamber, for the first time in its recorded history, laughed. The seasons turned. Spring came to the estate like forgiveness. Silvermoon rose again in the northern valleys, rebuilt stone by stone, and Mara traveled there often, learning her parents' land, planting her mother's healing gardens from the old texts Dr. Grange unearthed, and the scattered descendants of families who had once been allies of Alpha Rowan came down out of the hills one by one to see if the stories were true. They found them true. They stayed, and somewhere in that first northern summer, standing on a rebuilt wall at moonrise, with her wolf running warm and easy under her skin, Mara opened the crescent locket, which had unsealed itself, quietly and without ceremony, the week the trial ended, as if it had simply been waiting for the danger to pass. Inside was a miniature portrait of a man and a woman, her father's stubborn jaw, her mother's warm brown eyes, her own face assembled from theirs, and on the facing panel, engraved in letters almost too small to read, 6 words: "Be brave, be kind, come home." Mara stood on her family's wall, and held her family's faces and cried, and it did not hurt. It was the other kind of crying, the kind that puts things back where they belong. Oliver grew tall and loud and completely well, his treatment finished, his final scans clean, and declared his intention to study medicine under Dr. Grange, who pretended to be burdened by this, and then rearranged his entire life around it within the week. Lily turned 6, and her drawings, which now papered an entire wall of the king's study by royal insistence, began reliably featuring 5 figures: a tall dark-haired man, a brown-haired woman, a tall boy, a small girl, and a rabbit, all holding hands under a crooked sun. And on an evening in early autumn, 1 year to the day from a certain dinner reservation, a black car pulled up outside the Silver Pine Lodge. Peter Hale had been warned this time, and had still not slept for 2 nights. But the party that came through the doors was nothing the poor man had prepared for. The Alpha King arrived carrying his daughter on his shoulders because she insisted on being tall enough to see the chandeliers. A 16-year-old followed, loudly rating the decor. And on the king's arm, in a simple blue dress, wearing an old silver locket and a ring of northern silver that had appeared there, to the delight of every gossip on the continent, during the summer in Silvermoon, was the lady of the northern valleys, who stopped in the doorway of her old workplace, looked at the trembling staff lined up to receive her, and ruined all protocol forever by hugging the pastry chef. They sat at the same table. They were served, at Mara's laughing request, by the newest and most junior waitress on staff, a terrified 19-year-old, whom Mara spent the evening quietly tipping a fortune and telling, twice, that she was doing wonderfully. There was chocolate dessert, there were cherries. Lily counted them out loud and demanded the story again, the whole story, even though she had lived it, because 6-year-olds understand better than anyone that the point of a story is not information. So around that table they told it in pieces, each of them owning their part: the empty tray, the 7 cherries, the fair, the snow on the terrace, the birthday with the paper crown, the rabbit standing guard on a hospital bed. And when the story was over, Lily climbed onto her chair, took Mara's arm with great ceremony, and pushed the sleeve gently up to show the thin white line that ran along it. the mark the whole year had grown from. She traced it with one small finger and announced it to the table, and to the staff pretending not to listen, and to the world in general, with the absolute authority of a child stating the obvious. "This is where she saved me," Lily said, "and then we saved her back." Under the table, Damien's hand found Mara's, the way it now did, 100 times a day, in councils and gardens and quiet kitchens, without either of them needing to look. Outside the tall windows, the moon was rising over the city, full and white and patient, and it shone on the fortress in the hills where the lights burned warm now, and on the far northern valleys, where Silver Moon's fires had been lit again after 20 years, and on a scarred arm in a beautiful restaurant, and on a family that no blade, in the end, had managed to cut apart. Mara Ellison had walked into that dining room 2 years ago as an invisible girl with a water pitcher, carrying nothing but a promise to a sick brother and a locket she could not open. Everything she was had been hidden from her. Everything she loved had been dangerous to keep. And she had answered all of it, the hunters and the kings and the whole armored world, with the only weapon she had ever actually needed, the one her mother had engraved beside her own face, the simple, stubborn, world-altering decision to be brave and be kind. She had done both, and she had, at last, in every meaning of the words, come home.